Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're looking into some of the latest developments in U.S. politics and the economy. We're going to be drawing on some great reporting and analysis from Radio Seoul's Today's USA program, hosted by the very insightful Kang Yi-jin. And I think it's safe to say that things are moving pretty fast over there. There are some surprising appointments to talk about, and certainly a lot of talk about spending cuts. So let's dive in.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep up with, that's for sure. It feels like every day brings some new headline that has everyone talking.
I mean, where do we even begin? I guess one of the most talked about developments has to be Elon Musk's new role. He's now the head of President Trump's government efficiency task force. What are your thoughts on having someone who's not exactly a career politician leading such a crucial effort?
Well, it's certainly an unconventional choice. You know, Musk is known for shaking things up in the tech world, and now he's bringing that same disruptive energy to the government. Axios has been using this phrase, masculine maximalism, to describe this approach. It's about being bold, ambitious, and not afraid to break with tradition.
Yeah, I've seen that phrase thrown around. And it definitely seems to apply here. I mean, Musk has even talked about getting rid of entire federal agencies. He's compared inefficient bureaucracy to weeds that need to be uprooted. Pretty strong imagery, right?
It is, and it's certainly gotten people's attention. But, you know, the question is, can you really just rip everything out and start over? There's a risk of losing valuable expertise and disrupting essential services.
Right, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of accountability. If you streamline everything and reduce oversight, could that create a system that's more vulnerable to individual agendas or even corruption?
Those are all valid points and concerns that are being raised. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of spending cuts. The Trump administration has set some pretty ambitious goals. They're talking about a 30 to 40% reduction, which translates to something like $2 trillion. But when you actually look at how the budget is structured, it's hard to see how they're going to achieve that.
Yeah, the math just doesn't seem to add up. A huge chunk of the budget, around 75%, is dedicated to mandatory spending, things like Social Security, Medicare, debt interest. There's not a lot of wiggle room there.
So is this $2 trillion target even realistic? Are we going to see some major policy shifts, or is this more about political posturing?
Well, it's hard to imagine them reaching that target without making some fundamental changes to mandatory spending programs, and those are programs that are deeply intertwined with the social safety net. So any changes there would have a huge impact on a lot of people.
And then there's the issue of the federal workforce itself. A judge recently ruled in favor of the administration's voluntary resignation program. And we've seen reports of around 75,000 employees applying for it. But that still seems like a relatively small number compared to the total size of the federal workforce.
Yeah, it's about 3.75%. So while it's not as disruptive as mass layoffs, it could still have significant consequences. You're potentially losing experienced personnel, which could impact the government's ability to function effectively. And we also can't forget about the legal challenges. There are something like 70 lawsuits pending related to firings and agency restructuring.
So it sounds like we're potentially looking at a brain drain combined with a legal minefield. What kind of impact could that have on the government's ability to actually implement all of these ambitious changes?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but you could certainly imagine some turbulence. You know, managing these complex systems requires a lot of expertise, and if you lose that institutional knowledge, it could lead to chaos and delays. Plus, you have to think about morale among the remaining workforce. Facing potential cuts and restructuring can create a lot of anxiety and uncertainty, which in turn could affect productivity.
Yeah, it's not exactly a recipe for smooth sailing. And speaking of things that have raised eyebrows, there was that whole controversy surrounding the State Department's initial plan to buy a bunch of armored Teslas, like $400 million worth. With Musk leading the charge on government efficiency, it definitely raised some concerns about potential conflicts of interest.
The timing was certainly interesting, and while the State Department has since revised those documents, you know, they've replaced Tesla with armored electric vehicles, the whole incident still raises questions about transparency and accountability.
Yeah, and Musk has said that he wasn't aware of the deal beforehand. Does that really alleviate the concerns, or does it point to a deeper problem with communication and oversight?
Well, I think it highlights the need for clear guidelines and protocols when it comes to public-private partnerships. Even the appearance of impropriety can damage public trust. And that trust is especially crucial when a government is pursuing such radical changes.
Absolutely. And speaking of trust and radical changes, we have to talk about the administration's recent moves in Ukraine. It seems like a case study in unpredictability.
It's been quite a turnaround, hasn't it? We have the new Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin saying that the U.S. won't guarantee Ukraine's security post-war, and he's also discouraged NATO involvement in peacekeeping. Then just hours later, we have Trump having this unscheduled phone call with Putin, expressing support for a ceasefire on Putin's terms, seemingly without even consulting Ukraine.
Yeah, and President Zelensky has understandably voiced concerns about being sidelined and potentially manipulated. These actions seem to contradict the administration's previous stance on Russian aggression. What do you think is driving this shift, and what does it signal about the future of U.S. foreign policy?
It's tough to say for sure, but it does seem like a move towards a more transactional approach, prioritizing immediate gains over long-term strategic alliances, and that could have some pretty significant consequences for international relations. If the U.S. is seen as an unreliable partner, it could undermine its credibility on the global stage.
Yeah, it's like we're entering uncharted territory. And then, as if things couldn't get any more unpredictable, we have these incredibly controversial candidate confirmations. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., known for his anti-vaccine activism, has been confirmed as Health and Human Services Secretary.
And then there's Tulsi Gabbard, a former Democratic congresswoman with pro-Russia leanings and no prior experience in intelligence. She's been confirmed as Director of National Intelligence. And both of these confirmations faced minimal opposition. Just a single Republican senator, Mitch McConnell, voted against them.
Yeah, it's definitely left a lot of people scratching their heads. What kind of message do these appointments send about the administration's priorities and its approach to governing?
Well, it's a pretty clear departure from the traditional emphasis on experience and expertise. It suggests that loyalty and alignment with the administration's agenda are taking precedence. And it remains to be seen what the long-term implications will be, but it's certainly a gamble.
It feels like every day brings a new surprise, doesn't it? And speaking of surprises, we have one more twist to discuss. Trump's decision to appoint himself chairman of the Kennedy Center after dismissing the previous chairman.
Yeah, that was a pretty bold move. It's drawn a lot of criticism from the arts community. Some artists have even chosen to leave the center in protest. It's being seen as a power grab, and it raises concerns about artistic freedom and the independence of cultural institutions.
So let's take a step back for a moment. We've covered a lot of ground here. Musk shaking up the government, spending cuts that don't quite add up, a Tesla controversy, a foreign policy U-turn, and some eyebrow-raising cabinet appointments. It's clear that this administration is operating on its own terms, rewriting the rules as it goes along. But what does it all mean?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What are the long-term consequences of this break from tradition? Will it lead to greater efficiency and a stronger America? Or will it create instability and erode trust both domestically and internationally?
This deep dive has certainly given us a lot to ponder, but there's still so much to unpack. In our next segment, we'll delve deeper into these developments and explore the potential ramifications of this new era in American politics. Feels like we're watching some kind of political thriller unfold, full of twists and turns.
Definitely keeps you on the edge of your seat.
We're trying to make sense of it all, right? These drastic changes and what they might mean in the long run.
Right, and I think to really grasp the implications, we need to look beyond the headlines. Analyze the patterns that are emerging, like the shift in Ukraine policy. That's a prime example. It raises some fundamental questions about the administration's commitment to its allies and its overall approach to global affairs.
Yeah, it's a pretty dramatic shift from Trump's earlier stance. Remember all the controversy surrounding those phone calls with Zelensky, which led to the first impeachment. Back then, he seemed much more supportive of Ukraine's efforts to resist Russian influence.
Yeah, it does feel like a one time ago, but now it seems like the administration is prioritizing a different set of interests, aligning more closely with Putin's agenda, which, risks emboldening Russia, and further destabilizing the region. What's particularly concerning is the lack of consultation with Ukraine itself.
Yeah, Zelensky's concerns about being sidelined are understandable. This shift could have a domino effect, sending a message to other nations that U.S. support is conditional, potentially unreliable.
Exactly. And if the U.S. is seen as an unpredictable partner, that could really undermine its credibility on the global stage. It has implications not just for Ukraine, but for the broader international order.
It really makes you wonder, what are the guiding principles of this administration's foreign policy? Is it about maintaining a strong global presence, promoting democracy, or pursuing a purely transactional approach?
That's a question a lot of people are asking. The recent actions seem to point towards a more transactional approach, prioritizing short-term gains and personal relationships over long-term strategic alliances and democratic values.
And this brings us back to the domestic scene and those controversial cabinet appointments. Having figures like Kennedy Jr. and Gabbard in positions of such authority raises some serious concerns.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Placing individuals with limited relevant experience and such controversial stances at the helm of crucial departments like Health and Human Services and National Intelligence, it's a bold move, some might even say reckless.
It really challenges the conventional wisdom that experience and expertise are essential qualifications for these roles. Is this a deliberate strategy to disrupt the status quo? Or is it a sign of something more troubling, like a disregard for the institutions themselves?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely raises questions about the administration's judgment and its commitment to sound governments. Let's take Kennedy Jr.'s appointment to Health and Human Services, for example. His anti-vaccine views could have significant implications for public health policy.
Yeah, that's a concern shared by many in the medical community. Could this lead to a weakening of vaccination programs, potentially putting vulnerable populations at risk?
It's a real possibility. And then you have Gabbard's appointment as Director of National Intelligence. Her past pro-Russia statements and lack of experience in intelligence raise questions about her ability to effectively lead this crucial agency.
It's so essential for the intelligence community to remain objective, free from political influence. With Gabbard at the helm, will we see a shift in priorities, potentially impacting national security?
It's too early to say for sure, but it's definitely a valid concern. Her appointment, along with Kennedy Jr.'s, seems to signal a willingness to prioritize loyalty over expertise.
It's a pattern we're seeing emerge across different sectors. The Kennedy Center incident with Trump appointing himself chairman is another example.
Yeah, pretty blatant power grab. Undermining the independence of cultural institutions, it fits into a broader trend of this administration consolidating power, disregarding established norms.
It all points to a fundamental question. What is the role of expertise and experience in governing? Are these values being eroded, replaced by something else? Maybe loyalty or ideology?
That's a crucial question for any democracy. A healthy system relies on a balance of power, informed decision-making, and respect for institutions. When those elements are weakened or disregarded, it can have far-reaching consequences.
It feels like we're witnessing a shift away from those established norms. It's a gamble.
Yeah.
And it's unclear what the payoff will be. But one thing's for sure, the stakes are high.
Absolutely. We're talking about the health of our democracy, the stability of the international order, the future of American leadership. These are not issues to be taken lightly.
It can feel overwhelming at times, but we can't just tune it out. As citizens, we have a responsibility to stay informed, engage in thoughtful discussion, and hold our leaders accountable.
Couldn't agree more. Apathy is not an option. We need to understand the implications of these changes and make our voices heard.
This deep dive has really illuminated the complexities of this new political landscape. But one question keeps coming back to me. What is the end game here?
That's the question everyone's asking. What's the vision for the future that's driving these bold and often disruptive actions?
Feels like we're constantly being bombarded with news these days, right? Just a never-ending stream of shocking headlines. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day chaos and lose sight of the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's definitely information overload out there.
So I guess that's why we're doing these deep dives, right? Trying to take a step back and make sense of it all. And one of the things that keeps coming up in our discussions is this idea of masculine maximalism, this bold, aggressive approach to governing. Do you think it's a sustainable model? I mean, what are the potential long-term consequences of this shift?
Well, history teaches us that sweeping changes often come with unintended consequences. You start drastically cutting government programs without fully understanding the impact, and it could lead to all sorts of unforeseen social and economic problems down the line.
Right. It's like you're playing a game of Jenga. You pull out the wrong piece and the whole thing comes crashing down.
Exactly. And then there's the question of relying on figures like Elon Musk. I mean, bringing in people from outside the traditional political sphere can bring fresh perspectives and new ideas, but it also creates new vulnerabilities, especially when it comes to potential conflicts of interest.
Yeah, we've already seen how that can play out. And we've talked about the potential consequences of sidelining expertise and experience in favor of loyalty and ideology. It all paints a pretty uncertain picture of the future.
Uncertainty is definitely the defining characteristic of this moment. But I think it's important to remember that uncertainty doesn't have to be paralyzing. It can also be a catalyst for engagement.
I like that. This deep dive has certainly been a real eye-opener for me, highlighting the complexities and potential pitfalls of the path this administration is taking. But it's also a reminder that we're not just passive observers. We have a role to play.
Absolutely. A healthy democracy relies on informed and engaged citizens, people who are willing to ask tough questions, hold their leaders accountable, and advocate for the values they believe in.
So what does that look like in practice? How can we move beyond just feeling overwhelmed and actually make a difference?
Well, it starts with staying informed, not just about the headlines, but about the underlying issues. It means engaging in thoughtful conversations, even with people who hold different views. And it means making our voices heard through voting, contacting our representatives, participating in our communities.
It's about recognizing that we're not just spectators. We're active participants in shaping the future of our country.
Well said. And remember, the future isn't predetermined. It's something we create collectively through our actions and choices.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to encourage everyone listening to stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful. The future is ours to shape.